So we've just shared a little kind of private joke before pressing the record, but that's why we're both smiling. But this is probably not a smiling matter, is it, Gary? Because the topic of this is a pilot for a series that we are kind of thinking about, which is called Looking at the World in a Different Way. Now, that sounds really kind of, on the one hand, possibly potentially pretentious, but it also sounds maybe a little bit prescriptive. It also sounds maybe possibly a little bit controversial. And because I'm with Gary Shearer and we have good conversations, well, it's mostly Gary's ideas and I'm just kind of nodding sagely like I understand what's going on with the world. It feels like we should be capturing probably these things and more. So this is what this episode is all about, is kind of teasing out some of the topics that we have been musing on for a while. And we think these are pertinent things. And we think everybody should consider looking at the world in a different way. But because I've got Gary here on this podcast, this is not me saying, here's our list of things. This is really an exploratory conversation. So we haven't scripted this. We don't know really where this is going to go. We just know it's going to go somewhere. So I think for me, this is quite an interesting beginning because we want to use this as a little bit of research, really, to find out from ourselves kind of which way we're going to take this, looking at the world in a different way, but also to get your view. If you're listening to this or watching this, what do you think? Have we hit the mark? Have we missed the mark? Are there places you want us to go to in this conversation? Let us know. Put the feedback in the boxes below and communicate with us. But Gary, I mean, this is a big old topic, isn't it? I know you have many feelers into many different sort of sectors of kind of world economy, the environmental side of things, philanthropy. There are so many ways and angles that we can come at this, looking at the world in a different way. I mean, where do we begin with such a broad topic? Kind of where's your head or your mind or your heart at this point?
Wow, Neil, that's quite a question.
That was a tricky one to start off, isn't it?
My head and heart are all over the place because there's so much happening in so many places that need attention. I think in everything we do, and we play an advisory, inquiry, guiding, strategic role for philanthropy and corporates and whoever else requires it or requests it. And at the essence of everything that seems to be forgotten all the time is humanity. It should be about us, each one of us, and our well-being and how well we can or should be reacting to situations and how we can react differently. I meet some incredible people from around the world, some incredible change makers who are doing and thinking of other ways of being, of other ways that we can be. And the reality is that we come back to the essence of humanity all the time. In almost the ancient indigenous wisdom. And I know that's putting that approach in a box, which some people don't agree with. But in one of the discussions I had with a global group who are a think tank and who are really looking at some wonderful options and alternatives on how we should operate, we agreed that we're living in the most delusional time, I think, that the world has ever lived in. If I look around the world and I see the chaos that's going on in almost every country in the world, the lack of attention that's being paid to people's real needs, the coordinated efforts of governments everywhere to instill and introduce technocratic and technological responses to solve things, to solve climate, to solve the failure of education. It's just more external approaches that aren't really going to solve anything. I was with a wonderful gentleman this morning who said, and I wrote it down, it was so powerful. He said, the unreasonable effectiveness of modernity is what one of the problems is. We always add more layers of control that separates us more and more from each other and from life. And I thought that was very powerful. Because as we head into this world where people are desperately, or seemingly desperately, or maybe even coercively sometimes, leading us down certain routes and allowing only one prevailing narrative that's frustrating people, I mean, France is on fire at the moment. Many countries are on fire. And interestingly, France's mainstream media aren't reporting it, but it's all over all the social media platforms. What is it? Why are we not paying attention? Why are we not listening more carefully? Why are we trying to get everybody to think in the same way, sing from the same hymn sheet? It's really crazy. We are all individuals, and we need somehow to find a way to coordinate that, to look and listen more deeply.
How do you think we've fallen into this? Because I was at a festival of sustainable business yesterday, and in the lunch break was very fortunate enough to sit next to a very wise chap who turns out also to be South African, strangely enough, and perfect coincidence there. And he was talking very much about kind of the narrative of Africa kind of right now, and some really interesting sort of projects that he was getting involved in. And yeah, probably that's a conversation for another time to kind of pick your brains on that one. But
yes,
I think the one thing that we were talking about very, very much was this kind of one story narrative, depending on where you look or who you're listening to. That there is no conversation, there is no dialogue. Everything is kind of positioned as a monologue. There's one view, there's one truth, and I've got such a big issue with that, particularly as, you know, a marketer 3.5 decades into my career, kind of halfway nearly, I think, and just sort of thinking, this is just, it's fundamentally wrong, isn't it? I mean, the whole basis of, you know, science, the whole basis of humanity, of society, of community is that you have opposing opinions and you discuss, you sit around the fire or you sit across the boardroom table and you healthily debate alternative opinions. How have we got into this state where, unless mine is the official narrative, everyone else is wrong? How have we got here? I mean, it is quite bizarre, but fascinating at the same time, isn't it?
yeah. I think we've got here by rewarding the wrong things and instilling the wrong kind of approach to life. We live in a very competitive society. You know, I was really blessed to have my children go to a Rudolf Steiner school where there are no marks given out every year. Each child performs to their best and gets nurtured to their best of their own abilities that they've been given. And it's fascinating to see that work. Whereas if you extrapolate what happens in the schooling systems, top dogs, best sportsmen, top academics, in whatever perspective you take, it then goes off into the big wide world out there, the corporate world, where it's dog eat dog, and I must get to the top, and I must make as much money as possible and get as much power as possible. And that's, I think, where the problem is. It's on a global scale now where, and you know, Karl Marx and all sorts of people have warned about this, that capitalism would, if it became too powerful, Abraham Lincoln said so. He said, if it becomes too powerful, it will be out of control and it will dominate us. And I mean, I love if you think of what Orwell's 1984 book predicted, we live right in that space now, except that he didn't see it as corporates who would own everything, fund everything, provide governments with funding. I mean, governments don't provide their own medical health boards with funding anymore. Big Pharma do. It's like one of the rugby players in a rugby team refereeing, and he's only on the one side. That's absurd. And no one sees any fault in that. But the cracks are starting to show now because the truth will out. And this is not a conspiracy talk. I mean, you look around the world at the moment and see how many, today in the Washington Times, there's an article. Our government lied to us. The masks didn't work. Lockdowns didn't work. The vaccines didn't stop transmission, to use a current topic without trying to be contentious. But that's what happens. And it happens across the spectrum. And if you don't agree with the prevailing narrative, which if you look more deeply is more often than not based around a technological solution, which will make somebody lots of money. I mean, the other ones, these sound all so conspiratorial, but I have friends who share these things with me. And 5G, there are a lot of health professionals who are concerned about the impact of the high frequencies of 5G. There's studies, there's all sorts of things being done. But governments and cellular companies are not interested because they have a plan. They're cutting trees down in here in the UK. I'm not sure if you know that. In Plymouth the other day, they cut down, I think it was 116 really old trees in the center of Plymouth in the middle of the night. Why would they do that? People tried to stop them when they heard what was going on, and they stopped. I think there were a couple left by the end of the night when all these, as the one bystander said, mechanical monsters moved in and started ripping trees out of the ground. In the name of what? Climate change? Something to do with what the council said it was for was absurd. But it goes ahead. It's almost an unstoppable force now. And somehow citizens need to, I don't like to use the word take back the power. Citizens need to look carefully at what isn't being done for them and how inappropriately governments all over the world are behaving. They're not looking after their people. They're doing top-down, tech-led, and I love technology, by the way, and I'm not anti-tech. It's just not always, or if ever, the only solution to a problem. Again, going back to what we said at the beginning, it's about the people in the system, how they're feeling, what is their well-being like, what is their view of a situation. And that should be taken into account, particularly the view of people. If you think about it, I was speaking to a British friend this morning, and we talked about how Brexit happened because the government weren't paying attention to the people who weren't living in the cities. And the people who are being left out of the system, they had nothing to lose. They've got nothing anywhere. So it's like, well, this sounds like a better idea. I might get more attention to me. And that hasn't been delivered to. There's been such squabbling at this level where the will of the people, and I'm not from here, so I'm just observing, as we try and do in everything we do. We try and observe without engaging with our emotion, but it's very tough. Because
I was going to say it is a very fine line, isn't it? Because, and I always like to think of myself, yes, I have at times been, I wouldn't say accused, but I have been, the words conspiracy and theorist have been used in my presence a number of times. I'm just questioning. I'm just asking. I don't necessarily have a view on all of these things. I'm not necessarily perfectly advised on all these things, but it's been demonized, hasn't it? And particularly by elected, I don't want to get all political here. I mean, you'd lose me if we did. But if we were to kind of say, look, in the UK here, we have a political system that is democratic. We have elected officials who are, so say, representing us. And yet, as soon as that happens, we don't actually feel like the representation is actually reflecting what it is that we've elected them to do and to achieve. And then it all then sort of turns around. And I think there's something kind of awry here, which simply doesn't add up. And I think, if we go back to 2020, and you and I have had this conversation over a long period of time, the impact of a certain, and I'll use the word, all right, this might get shut down as an episode, but I'll use the word lockdown, the first of the more contentious words that we might possibly cover in this series. If, as an audience, you want us to go there, let's talk about that. Put the comments in the thread below. It just kind of, it seemed to change everything. This feels like a very different, well, you've talked before about shifting consciousness, about this whole thing about, authentic, honest, transparent, true, coming from a place of heart. It feels very different this side of 2020. And is that to do with the technology? Is that to do with the current political system? Is it to do with big corporates and their influence? I don't know. These are kind of rhetorical questions, and I'm not expecting you to kind of necessarily say, well, here's the answer, Neil. But it does feel so different, doesn't it, than say 2019 and earlier. There's a real momentum gathering here that kind of, as I say, demonizes any alternative view. That's the one I've got the biggest issue with. It's like, that's not how we were brought up. We were brought up to challenge if we didn't feel it was fair or if we didn't feel it was true. And you'd be listened. It was a conversation, a dialogue, not a monologue. It wasn't one-way traffic of opinion. You were allowed to have an opinion, but certain words even demonized as well. I don't know, this kind of macro thing, as you say, it's happening all over the world.
Absolutely. You know, Neil, what you say about from 2019 onwards, it seemed to change. I'm just looking up here, a top universities, a tool of the future. Because if you think one of the most he says here, one of the most unsettling events of the past 3 years has been the globalized, coordinated messaging of socioeconomic missives and policies throughout the world. I've been astonished at how we're living in England now. We've been here for our 5th year. And whatever happens here happens back in South Africa within a day or two. The same bulletins, the same instructions, the same kind of lockdowns. And we are using the term lockdown, but it happens so often. And then it mysteriously just happens all over the world. This particular article is about transgender politics and policies. How all of a sudden it's just come out of nowhere and surfaced. I'm really not against any discussions about it or anybody expressing their needs or being who they feel they are, and it's perfect for each human being. But to have a dismissive, dominating narrative that no one's allowed to question, that gets professors fired from their schools all over the world for daring to use the wrong pronoun, gender, whatever it is in that particular moment, is really weird. There's no tolerance whatsoever, and there's only one narrative. And then, when people tell me that there's somebody coordinating this behind the scenes, I'm always disagreeing with them. I said, I don't think that can happen. No, it's the Illuminati. No, it's whoever it is. I think for me, it's just a common gathering of so many people with power who are trying to, and I'm not sure if it's repair, fix, or control the world. And if you think about digital passes and handing over all of our data and the very contentious World Health Organization pandemic treaty that the WHO are trying to push through, that apparently, from what I've read as well, takes away the sovereignty of countries in the event of a pandemic. And those things are really disturbing. Again, I have no issue with everybody coordinating to look after health. But if you look at what's happened over Africa, where, again, this topic of the pandemic is almost unavoidable to talk about. In Africa, there's something like 6% of people across Africa were vaccinated. And the amount of deaths in most of the countries, except I think 3, South Africa was one, where COVID was a little more present, but nothing like the first world countries. And people are really resilient and live such tough lives there that it didn't affect them for some reason. The scientists are very puzzled about that. And yet they're still talking about how they're going to make sure everybody in Africa gets an mRNA vaccine. I'm not sure why, when it didn't affect them. And there are other ways of looking at it, other ways of strengthening immune systems, etc., which leads me back to, so is there something behind this? Again, I don't know. But all of these elements stack up. And if you start thinking and looking at them carefully, and there isn't an answer, and one of the answers is some form of control. I mean, the Dutch farmers have been fighting a battle for, I think, 18 months or more, visibly. Not one mainstream report about the tens of thousands of Dutch farmers stopping airports, driving on highways, driving all the way across the country, shutting ports down, all sorts of chaotic things. But something so delicious has come out of that, which I'm hoping will be the way forward in the world. And that's that the Farmers' Party in Holland have the most seats in their Senate, completely from nowhere, not just voted for by farmers, but by people who are not comfortable with a situation of some kind of centrist control or central force or central think tank putting their ideas out onto the world without checking in with anybody else. It's like, here's how we're going to fix it. And that's crazy. It's just going to cause more chaos and more of what's happening in France right now, where this morning I got a video of the municipality in Bordeaux. The offices are on fire. And in Paris, cars on fire, people going crazy. And the article was about how they're tired of being treated like serfs and peasants by the elite. That's a warning. It's a warning that we need to start paying attention and listening more carefully, and not just roll out more guards to come and beat people up with clubs. And I mean, it's really quite dystopian when you think about what we've seen on television, these thuggish, brutish guards stopping people demonstrating peacefully, singing songs and saying, "You're not allowed to do that anymore. Go away. We'll take you away forcibly." That's concerning. That means there's something behind all of this. It's almost unavoidable to start thinking like that.
And it is one of those moments where you think, if this was done with good intention, so from a position of love, not fear, then some of the technologies, some of these approaches, as you say, the coordinated, resilience of the world, working together with good intention, that the results could be incredible. This could be the peace that John Lennon was, talking
Yes.
about sort of many, many decades ago. But actually, as you say, when you start looking into this and when you start seeing some of the reactions, it doesn't feel like that at all, does it? It's very hard to spot the good in this, even if that is your starting point. If you begin to look into this, you look at the narrative, you look at some of the, let's call them alternative reporting sources, so not the mainstream media, people literally on the ground with a camera and actually filming live real time. It's really hard to fake that. And yet that's called fake news. If this was all done in a way that was, with great intention, then we're off to a really, really good thing here. And this last 2 or 3 years, you could look back probably in the future and think, we didn't realize it at the time, but wow, that was for everybody's good. But no matter how you view this, no matter who else you listen to rather than the mainstream reporting, you smell a rat, don't you? There is this British phrase, smelling a rat. You just know, we don't have the answer. We don't know that this isn't a good thing, but there's just something which doesn't intuitively feel right. But the trouble is there's no playbook. There's nobody who's actually going to give you that feedback because you're not allowed to question. So therefore, there isn't an alternative view that you can actually go and ask the people who've got the alternative view, because they're just conspiracy theorists.
Absolutely.
So there's no kind of reliable alternative, is there? So when we talk about looking at the world in a different way, kind of almost relies on little enclaves of people who are questioning. They're not willing to just follow the prescribed narrative, or just as an individual, you're kind of probably there feeling on your own in lots of ways. And you sort of think, well, I can't really talk to people about this because I'll be labeled, I'll be judged, oh no, I'm kind of against things. Well, I'm not against things, I'm just asking, and it's difficult, isn't it, to not be a, let's use the word, sheep in this.
Yes. It's fascinating, Neil. If you think of the amount of top cardiologists, highly cited scientists, erstwhile being the top of the pile prior to the pandemic being top of their pile, and now being dismissed as crazy nutters, why would you just not listen to them? Why would you shut everything down? I mean, Asim Malhotra here in the UK, he was the BBC's poster boy for advocating the jab. And now that he's changed his opinion, he's considered a lunatic and a conspiracy theorist. That doesn't make sense. Just that one example. And people, top people, the Great Barrington Declaration, that was my turning point of really thinking this is not good. Because the Great Barrington Declaration, for any of the listeners who don't know, is a paper on a better way to manage all of this that would involve looking after the most vulnerable and allowing people to get on with their lives, but by being cautious. So you can find it on the internet. It now has about 1 million signatories, with about 60,000 scientists signing the papers. And the people who started it were 3 leading epidemiologists, I beg your pardon. One from Harvard, one from Oxford, and one from Stanford. Now, for them to be labeled mad nutters is really odd, because they've come from the most venerable institutions in the world. And why would they jeopardize their futures, their lives, their jobs? This is what's happened to any doctor or scientist who stood up in the world. They immediately get dismissed. And that doesn't smell well. It just doesn't feel good at all. So why is this happening? And why do we allow it? Why do we live such delusional, accepting lives that everything is fine? That governments are just printing money freely to the point that the USA is now $33 trillion in debt on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. That's very odd. They've quantitative eased and done so many creative things to get to this point, and they're still carrying on printing money. The same's happened here now. This country that didn't have a deficit is now, I think, nearly £2 trillion in deficit too. What is that about? That's not managing yourselves very well. It's playing a very surface delusional game, maybe with a goal in mind, maybe not, but it doesn't feel like it doesn't have some kind of agenda.
And these are kind of some of the topics that I think, would make just for the series that we've, begun to evolve. This is still very early days. We're not quite sure of how frequently we would run, sort of episodes in this series, but we've explored, haven't we, a number of different topics. And I know if I just kind of run through this very quick list, and we'll see just from what we've discussed over this first sort of 20 minutes or so, kind of whether these really hold true, because I think actually on reflection they probably do. So the first thing we were looking at was the macro view, so kind of the bigger picture. We've touched on a few of the little moments there. Then we were looking at, and here we go, starting to get instantly confrontational here, bad politics and business, and that was all about being very self-centered, so corporates or politics being focused on self, so self-interest, etc. That'll be an interesting one. Shifting consciousness, we were looking at how and why we respond and behave in the ways that we do as a collective, as a community, as a society, as a nationality, whatever you want to sort of cut and slice this, typically as groups of human beings, we respond and behave in certain ways. That could be very interesting as a social experiment. We were looking beyond ESGs in terms of responding in touch with a local reality. I really like, I think that was yours, Gary, wasn't it, that one? Yes. Because it was a lot of the work you do has to have local appropriateness, if you like, and it has to be very, very kind of owned by literally people on the ground. So philanthropy, not just throwing money at things, but getting real kind of accountability and ownership at a local level. So I think that could be very interesting. We've also looked at changing narratives around the world. So this whole idea of paradigms, and, we're coming at this from a very questioning approach, which is no longer the favored approach, apparently, but we're not going to stop anytime soon. So that to me was a very interesting episode. We were looking at watching and listening beyond our own kind of perspective, so interpreting the truth. And this is where we're going to talk about truth theory rather than the C word theory, because depending again who you ask, and you're talking about some very eminent people here in your kind of examples, and there are people here who, as in a normal situation, would be perceived as being, the trustworthy, types, and suddenly they're not. So interpreting the truth and what is truth and trying to sort of unpick that could be very interesting. We also looked at helping others to help themselves, so proactive enablement. And that is, I think, all about, education, information, and allowing the questioning. I know I've banged on about this so far in this particular sort of pilot episode, and I think it is so. I'm really sort of passionate about this one. I think it is all very much about, enabling through education, information. And I know that, whenever I have just a little snippet more information, I just feel so much more confident to be able to discuss it and talk about it. So I'm sure everybody listening will kind of resonate with that. We're looking at, again, sustainable solutions, and this is your phrase, Gary, from inside out, not outside in. And that's again coming back to this kind of local kind of ownership and enablement. And I love that. That's a really interesting one, because sustainability, I think the narrative in sustainability, is very, very big and bold and audacious, and has to be, because, we are on the road to destruction basically at the current rate. So this needs to be, prescribed top down, probably in terms of regulation and legislation. This is a big theme that came through from the conference I was at yesterday, but then has to be interpreted locally. So you have to know what you are going to do to meet and support the regulations and legislation. So it's kind of joining up outside in and inside out. So, I'm sure you'll have a load to share with us on that one. Another one, which I think we kind of coined the phrase beyond tick box CSR. So we were looking at, from a business perspective, product, people, process, profit, saying it's okay to make profit. You need to be sustainable in business, but the right kind of profit. So value-driven, purpose-led. And to me, that's a key thing for those listening and representing others. So not necessarily from a personal perspective, but from a business angle, looking at the value-driven approaches, I think is going to be crucial here. And again, for a lot of organizations and for a lot of people, that is looking at the world in a different way, because that's not how they're being rewarded. That's not how their success is being currently measured. So I think beyond the tick box approach of, stakeholder engagement and reporting and financial success, I think we need to really be pushing some of those boundaries. And then the final one that we came up with on our little list of 10 opportunities was conscious capitalism, authentic stakeholder collaboration, which I guess comes full circle back to the whole idea of truth, honesty, authenticity, love, not fear. We've got to be aiming for that one. And so for me, that was a lovely kind of rounding off that kind of brings that series full circle. Does that still kind of hold true to you? What kind of jumped out to you then, having had a bit of a conversation and revisited that list? Is there anything in there that you're kind of really feeling into sort of more than others?
All of them are so relevant, but I think even the statement, why we behave as we do, has its impact on almost everything. ESG has became the latest buzzword and is now being found to be very wanting. That companies are it's almost a whitewash for most companies. The same with CSR, CSI, when it becomes a bottom line entry in the balance sheet if any funds are spent or donated at all. It's not true engagement with your staff, with the communities around where you have operations, with the people who your consumer base who you supply. And what companies don't realize is that companies that do that thrive. And people are looking for it. A friend of mine told me about it. He couldn't buy something the other day because his daughter wouldn't let him, because it had some ingredients in it that were from palm oil, and not palm oil per se isn't negative, but the way it's farmed and how people treat it in forests chopped down, etc. It's us. It's the way we are and the way we behave. So for me, the consciousness, the way we should look differently at everything, or try and look differently at everything that we believe in is right, in inverted commas. Those jump out at me. Conscious capitalism, beyond tick box CSR, beyond ESG, because too often, as I've already said, it's just a whitewash. And that's not going to solve anything. And all of these things are put together with good intent, but they don't really solve anything. I mean, if you look at carbon credits, it's really crazy that you can let your factory carry on spewing stuff into the air and buy carbon credits because a community in Africa aren't doing the same. And so you balance things out, but you haven't. You've done nothing for the environment. You've just created another whole money system that the people who really need it don't end up getting.
So there's a carbon literacy thing going on there for sure. And having gone through the Carbon Literacy Trust training, fascinating. You identify very quickly how very little you actually know, from just, kind of mainstream communication. You really don't, not you personally, one doesn't really understand at all kind of what's going on until you delve 2, 3, 4 layers deeper. And then you think, oh my gosh, there's so much kind of cover up of the story and the narrative. I've always been really confused about that kind of offset thing. I mean, we won't go here in this conversation, but just the word carbon offset. I hired we were doing some moving of some sort of stuff at home a few months back, and the hire company, we hired a van, so self-drive stuff, self-loading into the van and things, and it was, you could spend an extra couple of pounds to carbon offset your hire. And I was thinking, hold on, really? Seriously? And whilst I am 100% behind trying to do my best in terms of carbon footprint, hold on. So I pay you an extra couple of pounds as a company, and I'm meant to be feeling better and I'm doing good for the planet.
Exactly.
And hold on, there's no indication there of how that is going to be offset. The offset probably is slightly dodgy, like you're explaining that. I won't say which company it was. There's no need to know which company it was. And I'm sure probably at a surface level, that was done with good intention. It was probably, we could offset, and if we can get the customer to pay, and kind of, it's sort of at a very low, loose, light level, it kind of adds up. But when you stop and think about it, it doesn't add up, does it? There is a money-making opportunity here that is probably fudged in terms of the actual process. And all it is doing is it could be at the very best carbon neutrality, but we need to be carbon positive. We need to be moving, for improvements to kind of really try and draw back some of this big issue that we've got. It's just missing the point, isn't it? It really is.
Totally. We are such a weird lot. We've evolved certain systems that we think are suitable and will work. And we've maximized and leveraged and inserted and pushed and cajoled and dominated and destroyed and extracted. And, coming from Africa, it's really apparent there. I was in a discussion with a global institute based in Europe this morning too, but my delight, they were talking about how Europe and Africa can engage more deeply to find a new way forward, with Africa playing the dominant role. Because this so-called first world that knows everything just doesn't seem to know very much, because it gets stuck in one particular place. And it deludes itself and squashes any dissent that comes up against that, as you said earlier, to anything that could make progress and change. And too often, in my view, the policymakers are out of touch people. In the work we do in philanthropy all over the world, so often the villages, the communities, the schools in the rural areas or in the remote areas, or even not remote areas, get orders or instructions or technology or new systems that don't suit them, that don't actually meet the demands or the challenges or issues that they have. But somebody who's usually out of touch makes a decision and implements that. And it generally doesn't work. That's the problem. And I must say, there's a lot of beautiful work happening around the world where people are engaging deeply and getting communities together to discuss their future and listening to them. There's a superb initiative in Morocco called the Tamkeen Community Foundation. And they're changing the whole education system, because they said to the Director General, if we really want to do this, let's go to every single school, get all the parents involved, talk to everybody, listen to their needs. And so that's how we function. If we've got to solve something or get involved in something, we don't follow the research that's come out of, and I know that's very contentious, we don't follow research that's come out of Paris, Geneva, London, New York. I'm not saying it's invalid, for sure, but it's often done by people whose lenses are different and who are looking differently into a situation that needs resolving. And they resolve it and make recommendations based on their perspectives. And that's not good. It's generally not what works. We've been all over Africa and in South America, and you ask the people, what was this building for? What was that for? And they go, we don't know. These people came here and they told us that it would really help us, and they built it or told us about it, and then they left. And the building is now derelict. And these are not stories. I've been there and seen it and spoken to the people where the well-meaning West, I think that's a bit of sarcastic well-meaning West that I said there. And I'm not anti-West. I'm not anti-anything. Not anti-capitalism. I think it could be an amazing system if it wasn't so domineering and extractive and exclusive, which is now, as I said, permeated into politics where no one listens to each other. and everybody else is wrong. I mean, America is in a horrendously polarized situation. I have no idea how they're going to get through that, because people are so against each other. And if you question anything, even if you're a liberal Democrat your whole life, these are friends of mine, and even my wife Laura and I have been accused of being Trump supporters. I mean, what's Trump got to do with me because I think X or Y about something? And it's not even his contentious stuff. It's just if you ask questions, you get labeled and you're not complying. So that's all of those things are where there's smoke, there's obviously some fire. And we see smoke everywhere. And in some instances, we're seeing fire now, as I mentioned earlier. People aren't happy. They're not content with how they're being looked after. And of course, there are two sides to every story. And sometimes the demands are ridiculous, but the demands are ridiculous because they can usually see those in powerful elitist positions having all they want. The criticism that went into the people arriving in Davos in COP27, I think it was, with thousands of private jets. And as one of them, the esteemed and venerable Mr. Bill Gates said, but I'm doing my bit to mitigate climate change, so I can fly in my plane. It's really weird that people think like they do. And of course, they'll think that I'm crazy to say this, but this is just looking as objectively as possible at what's going on around us. And it's a very difficult thing to do. And of course, I've got my own delusions, but we really need to stop and think, engage slowly and carefully. And to end with that little monologue off, sorry, I didn't mean to go on for so long. I was in a forum one day where a beautiful man named Peter Senge said, things are way too urgent to rush. Because what we do is we go in and we try and fix things quickly. We rush in with whatever we think is needed or will repair a situation. And we don't actually stop and engage and get to know and understand, discuss, listen, and then move carefully. Somebody on a forum said once, the SDGs are now 95 years away from being delivered to by 2030. That's really strange. It's really strange that we still talk about them. Of course, they're valuable and valid. But the person who made the statement said, imagine if we took away those identified goals with that timeline and just engaged deeply with the people in each situation and asked them where we could start and how they could be part of it and make them part of it, that we would well transcend things like these 2030 SDG goals. And I'm not saying they're not needed. It's how we go about it that needs some serious attention.
So you're listening to this and hopefully you are now thinking, wow, there's some stuff in here that could help me to view the world in a different way. We want to know what you think. So we've shared 10 kind of concepts and elements that we think actually would be super valuable to you to just open maybe a little window of opportunity for exploring, for questioning, and just being a little bit more conscious, to use that word. I was going to use the word mindful, but it's just more conscious and awake and aware of maybe what is actually going on around you. So without judgment, without prejudice, wherever we can, and certainly without, jumping in with all guns blazing and saying, we know what's right. This is what we are attempting to do, is to just tease out some of the opportunities for maybe not just accepting things for how they might first appear. So we want to know what you think. So using the message thread below, please do let us know if those 10 concepts, those 10 topics really resonate with you, or if you think we're missing anything, if you think there's a really hot topic. And believe me, we are willing, and with Gary around, we're able to go contentious if we need to. We've been very polite and very careful with the way we've couched this today, haven't we, Gary? I know you have some very deep opinions and passion about some of these items. You have been very, very polite. So we've kind of hopefully just whetted people's appetites here. We haven't gone deep into any of these things, and that is a conscious decision, really. We just wanted to kind of share with you guys where we're coming from, what the kind of things are that we're talking about. But believe me, once we get Gary going and we light that blue touch paper, Gary will share with us lots of really interesting stuff, I have no doubt. Have I pitched that too high, Gary? Are you willing to go
so,
there?
Neil. You're setting me up really badly here. I'm just somebody who listens a lot and learns a lot of things. I think we better pull some deep specialists in if we really got to get into this. But it'll be fun. It'll be fun to look at things from a different perspective and debate them openly and try and see if we can hear each other and look for and listen to a different way of being for all of us.
Great stuff. Thank you so much for your time, Gary. And let's wait and see what people think. And then we will be announcing the first of the episodes when that is going to happen very, very soon.
Fabulous. Thank you. It's been great fun.